Last week, you had names like Marvin Harrison, DJ Moore, Tank Bigsby, Breece Hall, who busted in fantasy football and lost people weeks. Well, in today's video, I'm bringing you 5 players that could do the same in week number 10. Guys, again, that I got bubble guts thinking about putting into my starting lineup. My hit rate through 9 weeks is 67%. The first player that I am scared to play, and look, I can't predict the future, anything's possible. There'll be players who go off on this list, of course, right? The math checks out, but I don't want to start Rico Dowdle if I have a better option out there. All right, Rico Dowdle faces the Eagles. There's a lot at play here in this take. But first off, the Eagles are the 3rd worst matchup for your running back when you adjust for schedule there, which is the most accurate way to determine a matchup. And if you look at the last 4 weeks in particular, by the way, the Eagles are tied for first in fewest points allowed to the running back position at 14.05 to an entire running back room. If you look at the Eagles defense against running backs specifically this year, Alvin Kamara had 15 points. He got bailed out because of his receptions, but averaged 3.3 yards per carry. Tyrone Tracy averaged under 4. Chase Brown had 2.6 yards per clip. The touchdown completely bailed out him with 11 fantasy points. And then Tank Bigsby just last week, who was on this video, by the way, had 2.7 yards per clip, 22 rushing yards, and 2 fantasy points. I don't want to target this matchup. I said it last week. I'll say it again. The Eagles defense is top 5 in fewest rushing yards and total yards allowed per game to opposing offenses. The Cowboys, by the way, come into this matchup, an NFC East matchup, with no Dak Prescott. They are 7-point underdogs. I just struggle to see a scenario in which they're able to establish the run game. And again, Dak Prescott is going to be out. So how effective do we really think that this offense can be without a Dak Prescott? Cooper Rush is no bum, but I'm just not so sure that this is going to be the game that Cowboy fans are going to want to watch and think about in the future. I'd rather start some of these names if you have them as options on your roster. I'd rather throw Chuba Hubbard out there versus the Giants, Ramondre Stevenson. I'd rather play Rachaad White, who has been much more consistent recently. Tony Pollard, who has dominated touches, by the way, for the Titans, and Kareem Hunt. Look, Kareem Hunt has not been efficient, but he gets so many goal line opportunities that it's hard not to play him over a name like Rico Dowdle. All right, the second name that I would prefer not to play, and I believe I'm going to get a lot of hate for this one. You know, every week there's a certain player that you get hate for in the comments. I think this might be the player this week. That is DeAndre Hopkins versus the Denver Broncos. I know he did great last week, but remember, last week he faced one of the weakest secondaries in the NFL. Guys, last week, DHop played the Bucks. The Bucks are top 3 in passing yards and total yards allowed per game to opposing offenses. That is not the case this week. The Broncos are top 6 in fewest passing yards and fewest total yards allowed per game. They just got dominated by the Ravens, but let's be honest, the Ravens are dominating everybody. Denver is the 6th worst matchup for your wide receiver right now in fantasy football. And if you look at wide receivers against Denver so far this year, I might have sounded like a broken record so far, but Pat Surtain's the truth, man. You can't play a wide receiver against Pat Surtain. I mean, last week we had Zay Flowers as a must start, but that's because Zay Flowers is a guy that you just use in so many creative ways. DHop, I feel like, is going to get shadow treatment from Pat Surtain. DK Metcalf had 29 yards. Pickens had 29. Mike Evans had 17 yards. And Garrett Wilson had 41. They've been able to shut down some elite wide receivers this year. The Chiefs, by the way, this doesn't help DHop's case. They are 8.5-point favorites, one of the biggest spreads of the entire week, which doesn't sound that appealing if you're relying on a Chiefs wide receiver because there's a very high chance that they could be running the ball out in the fourth quarter. You really want to rely on games where you can see a positive neutral game script where, you know, they're kind of like in the fourth quarter still need to rely on the pass a little bit. Look, if you have to start them, I get it. But if you have these options, I'd rather play them instead. Josh Downs, right? Josh Downs had 8 targets last week, had a 32% target share with Joe Flacco. George Pickens, I'd rather play him. Darnell Mooney, I'd rather play him. Even if Drake London is out there. Tank Dell in a good game versus the Detroit Lions. And Brian Thomas in a favorable matchup against the Minnesota Vikings. All right. The third player, we're going to stay in the same matchup here, but we're going to go to the opposite side of the ball. I do not want to play Javonte Williams if you have a better option, and I think most people will this week. He plays the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chiefs are the worst matchup, okay? No, not the second or third or fourth or fifth. No, they're the worst matchup for running backs in fantasy this year. So check this out. Derrick Henry, you know Derrick Henry, been on an absolute tear in fantasy so far this year. His worst week in fantasy was week 1 versus the Kansas City Chiefs. He averaged 3.5 yards per clip. He had 10 points and a touchdown, meaning he had 4 points outside of that touchdown that he got. Bijan Robinson averaged 1.9 yards per clip. J.K. Dobbins averaged 2.2. Just last week, Alexander Mattison, who was on this video series, by the way, averaged 1.1 yards per carry, under 10 fantasy points. The Chiefs defense is top 5 this year in fewest rushing yards allowed per game. The yards per carry at 3.7, total yards allowed per game, and total points allowed per game. Like I mentioned before with DeAndre Hopkins, the Chiefs are 8.5-point favorites, which to me, that game script doesn't favor DHop, but it also hurts a name like Javonte Williams. I don't think they're going to be able to establish the run. Denver actually has the lowest implied team point total on the week, and Audric Estime, I think, is going to start to become a problem. Does that happen this week? I don't know, but I can tell you just last week, he had a career high in snap share and in rushing yards, and he's averaging over 6.3 yards per carry this entire season. I'd rather start names like Rico Dowdle. I know we just talked about him, but I think Rico's a better start than Javonte this week. How about Jaylen Warren? I'd rather start him. Chuba Hubbard, Ramondre Stevenson, and Rachaad White. All right, we're going to stick with the running back position here, and it's really 2 names in particular, and I haven't felt good about these guys for a while, and that's been the right call. That's the Jags running backs. Guys, I really struggle to think of a scenario where you should start these Jags running backs. The matchup is terrible, first off. The Vikings, 6th worst matchup for your running backs. Recently, in the last couple weeks, the Vikings defense held Breece Hall to 37 total yards, 2.6 yards per clip, 7 fantasy points. They held Jonathan Taylor to 3.7 yards per carry, under 9 fantasy points. On the year, the Vikings are giving up the 3rd fewest rushing yards per game, and they're top 5 in passing yards per game. You just don't beat this team on the ground. You beat them through the air. The Jags, by the way, had the 2nd lowest implied team point total, or at least they're tied for it. So Vegas doesn't think they're going to put up a lot of points. And these 2 guys, Travis Etienne and Tank Bigsby, they are completely destroying each other's fantasy relevancy. I mean, they're the cock block for each other. Bigsby owners, they wish Travis Etienne was traded at the trade deadline. Etienne owners were hoping that when he came back, he'd be the clear number 1 in snap share. And if you look last week in week 9, so Etienne had 31% of the snaps, 6 touches. Bigsby had 8 total touches and 52% of the snaps. And Dearness Johnson still had a role. He had 24% of the snaps and 3 total touches. It's absolutely disgusting in Jacksonville. It is about as gross as it gets for a backfield. I'd rather start Javonte Williams. I know we just trashed on him. I'd rather start Javonte Williams than these 2 guys. Rico Dowdle, I know we talked bad on him, but I'd rather start him. Jaylen Warren, Chuba Hubbard, or Ramondre Stevenson. All right, the last player that, I'm a little bit concerned about playing this week, it is a quarterback. It's one of my favorite quarterbacks in the class. That is Drake Maye. Have been so impressed with him. Have been very happy with what I've seen so far. But this is not a matchup that I think we really want to chase. The Bears are actually the worst matchup for your quarterback in fantasy football. And just last week, the Kyler Murray owners will remember this. Kyler Murray was held to 157 yards and 4.7 fantasy points. He had 0 touchdowns. This is also the 2nd lowest over-under of the week at just 38.5 points. So even the sports books are not predicting a very high point total for both teams. And like Denver, which we talked about earlier, the Patriots are tied for the lowest implied team point total on the week with just 18 points. Look, I will say that Drake Maye has such a safe floor with his rushing upside. I don't hate it if he's just your best option and you have to throw him out there. I mean, he's averaging almost 50 yards per game on the ground. So that's like a 5-point floor. But I don't know, man. I just think there are better options on the waiver wire. For example, Aaron Rodgers, I'd rather play. I'd rather play Bo Nix. I'd rather play Baker Mayfield. I'd rather play Matthew Stafford or even Tua on Monday Night Football. So those are 10 players that I'm personally a little bit worried about here in week number 10. I say this every single week. I can't predict the future. All right. You're going to have to be a big boy, put your big boy pants on and make a decision for yourself. So many people love to come back to these videos and like the 1 or 2 players I missed on, they love to talk about that. Hey, take some accountability for your roster. I can't predict the future. I've presented you with the facts. I love you. I appreciate this community, but it's a little bit ridiculous sometimes. Take some damn accountability. If you agree with me and you have better options, then think about going that way. But, make the decision for yourself. I appreciate y'all for being here with me. Maybe you need to make a tough call this week. Check out the pinned comment where you can ask me a question anytime on the Flock Fantasy website. And if you don't have a free account on Flock Fantasy just yet, definitely go get you one. If you use the promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, at sign up, you will get a couple things for free, like the trade calculator, the team analyzer, and things like the expert consensus ranking. So I appreciate y'all for being here with me. I love you. I like to make this video every week. It's not an easy one to make. I'll be honest. It's not an easy one to make. Not a lot of people are putting content like this out. It's very easy to get trashed on. One of these guys are going to do great, but I appreciate you for being here, and we'll see you soon. All love. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.